Yes,
Um,
thanks.
yeah, recording has started. Hello to all members of SUG Chennai. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I welcome you all to the webinar on Learnings of Going Action Cloud with our esteemed guest speaker, Rob, who is a Sitecore MVP. I thank you all for joining us in this exciting webinar, and I thank Rob for accepting to share his expertise and taking time out of his busy schedule. Let's get ready to embark on an enlightening journey into Action Cloud with Rob. Thanks. The stage is all yours, Rob.
Thank you very much. Um, Maybe I thought I switched screens because I'm displaying widescreen right now. Um, is it is the visibility good for everyone, or shall I change the resolution?
I think it's fine. You can just proceed.
Okay, thanks. Good to know. Okay, so yes, thanks for having me and welcome all. I'm going to share some learnings of going XM Cloud coming from the more um, well-known DXP platform implementations. And I want to share what we came across on regarding architecture, regarding setting up and using Sitecore XM Cloud. My name is Rob Houdraken. I'm a technology director at IO. I do both technical consultancy and architecture work, and I have over 16 years of Sitecore experience. But as for a lot of us, XM Cloud is a whole new chapter, and for me, it's also a very exciting chapter. I'm a 8 times technology MVP, and I live in the Netherlands. It's something about my background. I'm very focused normally on Sitecore, but also on DevOps, both the methodology as well as setting up well-performing and efficient and secure and safe pipelines, but also on Azure and its infrastructure. So XM Cloud certainly brings some new elements to the table when it comes to setting up a new Sitecore environment. But before I will dive into any of the details, I want to share our experience in a more general way. I want to emphasize that we're very happy with XM Cloud and being able to already use it and implement it in a few of our projects. We think it really is a better architecture coming from Sitecore, but also a better architecture to work with. It's very quick to onboard both new developers onto an existing XM Cloud setup environment, but also onboarding a new customer on XM Cloud and setting up a new environment over there. That's very quick and easy. And provisioning and deployment certainly became way less effort, and that all has been very good to us. We did encounter some startup challenges as with learning any new technology or tool. And I think it lies both in us being new to XM Cloud as also XM Cloud being relatively new. But we see that a lot of things that we encounter are very quickly picked up by Sitecore itself. So that's great. I will share that in detail later on. So first, let's have a look at the general architecture of your Sitecore solution. And by that, I also mean our own implementation and actually application on top of Sitecore. And because when going SaaS, I think this also impacts the architecture of your own solution. It brings separation of concerns. It separates your own application, your own implementation more from the Sitecore product. And that's also one of the reasons Sitecore is now more in control of updates and upgrades and is able to deliver you both fixes and new features very quickly and also continuously. And all of that as a bonus also improves the resilience, the agility, and the maintainability of your own implementation. That does come with some limitations. If you look at how, or in regards to what you're used to been doing within Sitecore. First of all, you have to have a different mindset when it comes to setting up an application on SaaS software. Obviously, you're going to split the front end from Sitecore because you're now working headless, so will be headless, but also you're going to split the business logic from your Sitecore implementation. You're no longer building onto your Sitecore implementation, but more next to it. And I will show what that means in a minute. And that means that your integrations with the parties have to move towards the front end, pushed towards the head. And you also want to minimize any customizations on Sitecore itself. I think that's very important to be able to be future-proof, to make it easier to upgrade, but also make it better maintainable, easier manageable. And the last thing that should change in your mindset is that you should try to leverage composability as much as possible. So think in the same way of setting up elements that have their own concern, their own task in the whole landscape. And I have an example for that. Back in the days, we used to build monoliths with strongly coupled horizontal layers, and we layered all functionality on top of Sitecore. So we had our Sitecore implementation, and when we needed to integrate with, for example, a booking engine or a product catalog, we created integrations from the Sitecore CM role and made sure that the content was available within the front end. As I said, back in the day, so we're talking MVC. But going headless quickly became popular because, well, rapid innovation in front-end frameworks and also the desire to develop independently of the CMS. And that's a good thing, right? So, but that principle actually makes sense for all of the components in your application architecture. Decentralized governance, independent development and deployment, but also API-based integrations make for a much stronger architecture, and it makes your application more resilient, agile, and maintainable. So let's create a composable architecture here to apply all of those principles. First, I think, well, as you see here, we have the same external data sources, the product catalog, the booking engine, and also our external IDP. But I also kind of treat Sitecore content as one of the data sources. As a matter of fact, to our own application, also as an external data source. And then we're going to add a number of microservices that form our integration or maybe implementation layer, together with the implementation of our CMS. And all of those applications are managed independently. So we have Sitecore CM with Edge, serving the content, managing the content in the content database. But we also have a separate microservice, and you can build it in any technology you like. We often use .NET Core, but that's whatever floats your boat over there. So those are separately deployed and managed. And then we tie that all together, going to the front end. So all those sources are rendered. The content is populated, both static and dynamically here, because the Sitecore content is more or less static. Of course, we have our personalization, but the content coming from product and booking service is more dynamic, hence reference to static content coming from Sitecore. And we tie that all together in the front end, and in my case, that is a Next.js front end. And here you see that you are actually pushing the integration with your external data services towards the front end, and that your front end plays a more vital role in this in your solution architecture. And also this tells something about the role of your Sitecore instance within the architecture, and the fact that you no longer have to go over the CM with all of your data. And last but not least, you can add what I would call packed business capabilities. That's SaaS software that adds functionality to your platform, and without requiring you to actually manage the technology. So in a way, it's kind of the same as the Sitecore CMS, but you still deploy to CM, of course. So that's a little bit of in between. But you have products like Sitecore Search that can provide you with all the search functionality without actually having to manage the components, and that's also tied with the front end. And I think if you build it up like this, it is going to be a very modern and powerful approach of building web applications. It's a proven architecture that perfectly fits Axon Cloud. And if you look at it like this with this new mindset, you can also look differently at use cases that we used to implement or use Sitecore CMS for. So I have a use case where we have an external data source managed by our customer, and it is publishing product data. And we want to inject that into Sitecore as publishable content. Now, I should say we don't make a habit out of this. We don't always publish or always push content from external data sources to Sitecore, but in this case, we actually needed to do that and wanted to do that. So to be able to do this, first of all, we don't want to use the item API because we don't want to host this on the CM role. We want to avoid time coupling here. And we want to isolate the integration, both from a separation of concern, but also from a decentralized governance perspective. We want to use cloud native architecture, so using microservices and cloud resources. Well, we have the Sitecore authoring API that is going to allow us to actually build it like this. So in the past, we had the item API when we deployed on top of Sitecore CM to alter the database. But now Sitecore, apart from the Edge API, of course, to serve the content, we also have the authoring API. And what we've built is something like this. We have developed multiple microservices with a queue in between, and we retrieve the data from this external data source. And in this case, it's published using Kafka topics, and we retrieve the data from an API, and then we put that on a queue. So we have clearly separated integrating with the external data source from managing the Sitecore content. And then we do that in a different Sitecore editing service, one that we developed ourselves, which is a very clean and neat microservice that only takes items from the queue and creates the content in Sitecore using the Sitecore authoring API by using some GraphQL queries. I should say that this would also be perfectly possible with Sitecore Connect. But sometimes when you do not have the license for that, or if you don't need that product in your landscape, you might want to do it like this. But my point being is that you can do almost anything that you used to do without actually putting the integration of code on top of your Sitecore CM. You can do it in separately managed, agile and small, better manageable microservices. So when you look at the migrations scenarios that follow from that, and I don't want to go into detail here because I think this topic warrants a talk on itself, but to give you an idea on the options that you have in migrating your current solution to XM Cloud, you have basically two options. As you've seen, we want to push integrations to the front end, and we want to extract business logic from our platform DXP implementations. So if your one scenario would be carving out those integrations, that business logic, pushing it to the head for integration level and to separate microservices. And only then, when your platform DXP is back to its core capabilities for XM, and then you can more easily migrate this to XM Cloud. And one other example would also be to first move your search capabilities to Sitecore Search on your current platform DXP, and then you can remove your custom Solr instance, and you don't have to manage that anymore. So you're going composable like right away. And you make your solution more fit to more matching to fit XM Cloud as an architecture. And the other approach, if your delta is maybe a little bit bigger, is a hybrid approach. And in the hybrid approach, you're going to you're going to reuse as much as possible, of course. So you're going to reuse renderings depending on if you're already using Atlas setup or if you don't. And you start with a clean XM Cloud project, maybe transferring your data templates, your data, and using a reverse proxy while transitioning to migrate page per page or maybe per section to of your sites to XM Cloud. And then doing it like this, it's gearing a little bit more towards a greenfield setup with a lot of reuse. And actually, we're doing two projects right now on XM Cloud as we speak, and we have picked one of each scenarios for those because, well, the platform, the XP implementation we're coming from is different in both cases. So it's both a good approach. But let's go a little bit deeper into setting up XM Cloud and what we experienced here. And one of the first things that you bump into when you start working with XM Cloud, when you are setting up a new Sitecore implementation, is how to resolve the content from your data templates and content items towards your front end. We have several options, both out of the box as well as custom ones. And we also have a relatively new option being GraphQL. So let's look at what still works and what doesn't, and why you should use one option over the other. And the first thing to know, what is very important, is that XM Cloud no longer uses a web database. Content is resolved at publish time and not at runtime. So that means something for using custom content resolvers when you're having a headless setup. In some scenarios, your custom content resolvers will still work. By the way, contrary to previous rumors on content resolvers in XM Cloud, but in my opinion, they actually are always a last resort. And you don't want to customize stuff for future compatibility. So I have defined a few use cases, and with that, 3 categories, in which we used to actually create custom content resolvers. A few of those would still work, but I would advise against it, actually. So the first one is restructuring content by, for example, combining Sitecore items or creating a different hierarchy, or maybe reordering content like sorting and filtering. And you don't want to do that with a custom content resolver anymore. You have GraphQL for that. The second one is modifying the data model, maybe to make it more compliant with what the front-end developers would expect to get, simplifying the data model, but also maybe changing field names. I've seen it's been done a lot, but you shouldn't do it. I don't think should be an alternative for this. Just the best solution is actually to change your data model within the data templates. And for the field names, I also have a very quick and easy fix. And the last one is including dynamic or even contextual data, or performing additional operations at request time. And I also have seen scenarios in where we, for example, grab some personalization from an external data source and include that in the content being pushed towards the front end. And that's something you can no longer do, because this code will simply not be executed at request time anymore. A snapshot will be put on the edge, so you can't do this anymore. And what you actually want to do is these integrations need to be done at the front end. So if you want to personalize or do some dynamic data retrieval, then you have to request that from your front end, so from Next.js, for example. So actually, custom content resolvers are a last resort, or at best tolerated legacy when you're migrating over from DXP. So how to choose the best way to resolve your content? Well, it's actually rather straightforward. You either have a single item data source or require to fetch children. And if you need more than one level deep of nesting, you're either going to pick the folder filter resolver or the custom graph query. And that depends on whether you need to persist the hierarchy of your item structure, because the folder filter resolver is going to return you a flat list. So using a single data source, then you can use the data source resolver or the context item resolver, depending on your use case. And if you need one level of nesting, you can use the children resolvers. If you need a deeper level of hierarchy, then if you only want to retrieve items regardless of the hierarchy, then a folder filter resolver is going to work for you. And that's all default. You don't have to develop anything for these. And if that all doesn't work, then you can use a GraphQL query. And also try to restructure your content to make one of these actually work. That could be a little bit of work, but in the end is going to make for way less code and a more manageable, maintainable project. And I have a GraphQL example where we have a footer with multiple groups of links. So you can see here I have help, about us, and related sites. I'm not sure if it's easy to read on a smaller screen, but you can see I have 3 groups of links. And if you create a data structure for this in Sitecore, you would have a footer with groups, and beneath the groups, so below the groups, you have links. And that's something you cannot do with the default resolvers. So the resort here is a GraphQL query. Well, I'm not showing you this to explain how GraphQL works or as a tutorial, but I'm showing this more to show you how easy and how few lines of code it actually is to configure this. You can create any structure you want, and you can go deeper in hierarchy. And the benefit of this is that this all is also living on the front end side of things. So it's in your Next.js application. You don't have to deploy any customizations to Sitecore for this. So the next thing is, should I map my content structure? And I might need to explain this because I I've learned that not everyone is following this very well on what I mean by mapping, but sometimes you have a data structure within Sitecore that doesn't comply with what your front-end developers are actually expecting to get as a data structure, or it simply isn't as clean as they would like. So the names are not correct, or maybe there's some fields they do not use, or maybe there's some hierarchy in the output from GraphQL, or the layout result from the layout engine that just is maybe unnecessary for the use in front end. So the default structure might not always be ideal. So I've seen, and it's tempting, people creating actually a mapping to change the data model in the front end and create some sort of level of abstraction from Sitecore to develop front-end code, Next.js, React, or whatever other framework that works with a clean data model. But I would strongly advise against that, because it might seem you're introducing some abstraction, but it's actually less maintainable. If you're changing Sitecore fields, you have to change the mapping. So it creates a lot of default scaffolding work too. So with each item, each change in Sitecore, you need to update your mapping. And you're also repeating configuration. And one way or the other, you have to use the data model anyhow, because it's in your field mapping. So you're only kind of shifting the location of your challenge. I think it falsely suggests decoupling and independence of the CMS. You're still relying on Sitecore, so please don't do that and just use the output as you get it from Sitecore. But then sometimes the naming of the fields is not what you want. So for example, you have user-friendly field names in your templates with uppercase words and with spaces in between, and that's not what you want in your JSON. That's not your JSON name convention. So the best way to solve this is actually very, very simple. Don't use a friendly name for field names for field items, but the JSON field name. So that the actual name of the field is following the JSON name convention. And then you can use the title field within the item of your template field to actually create a user-friendly field name. And if you do it like this, within Sitecore, within the CMS, all the users, the editors, the marketers are going to see the friendly title field version, and JSON is going to be the output you expect. And this also removes any requirement for custom content resolvers or customizations. So onto a rendering configuration. I'm using Next.js, as I said, and I have a component hierarchy. And that's because we're also using Storybook and the atomic design principle. That's our own choice. So we have atoms, molecules, and organisms. But I want to be able to display our components and let our front-end developers work separately from Sitecore as well. While on the other hand, at the same time, I want to allow for optional GraphQL queries, and Storybook doesn't play well with GraphQL files, so you would need to mock its request to actually get the data. But we want a generic approach that works in each scenario, so GraphQL query or just default content resolver. And so we decided to split the components between Storybook and Sitecore. So actually what we have, what you can see, we have the component folder. We use our atoms, molecules, and organisms. And we have a separate Sitecore folder. And in the Sitecore folder are the only components that Sitecore actually sees. And this footer component over here is actually wrapping the actual component in Storybook. And what it does, it's In Storybook, it uses a JSON file for the mock data. And so we always have our mock data regardless if Sitecore is using GraphQL or not. And then we can add the GraphQL file to the component for Sitecore. So this setup is I think proven and works very well, and I've seen it on multiple other implementations as well. So I think it's the way to go. It might seem it's a little bit of creating a duplicate in components, but actually the actual component itself is in the organism, and the Sitecore footer is only using or placing that and tying it to the correct rendering configuration. And talking about rendering configurations, you have two options. You have static site generation, SSG, and the server-side rendering. But we actually do want to combine those two rendering configurations within a single Next.js app to optimize both performance and utilizing dynamically fetched data. So we can create exceptions to the default static site generation. That's what comes in the starter kit for XM Cloud. And the basic instructions are quite simple. And you have to create a physical path. By the way, this is the pages path file, which catches all routes. And it's configured, as I said, for SSG by default. You can change that to SSR and be done with it. And then you can do all the dynamic stuff you want. But we didn't want to do that. We want to still utilize getting static props, while on the other hand, also having our server props. So what you need to do is you need to create a physical path in your app on disk to catch specific routes. So imagine you have a Sitecore item that's called cart for your shopping cart. Then you will also have to create a physical path in your app, pages, cart, and then the path file. The path file works the same. And then set it up using get service side props. Don't forget to push the actual URL to Sitecore. So context params path needs to be populated with the current resolved URL. Otherwise, this is going to serve the homepage because it would know it works the same as the code above with the static props. So doing it like this, in theory, gets you hybrid rendering configuration. But this didn't work for us. There's a little bit more to it than meets the eye, because the starter kit is also using a multi-site add-on, and that also enforces static site generation. It also has a catch-all. So there's another file called middleware.ts, and that TypeScript file is part of the multi-site add-on, and it also has a catch-all. So you need to actually put your exception in there as well. And then there's one more location. In the multi-site GraphQL sitemap service, there is a method that's been used to fetch the list of pages for static site generation, and we also need to exclude our custom path over here as well. So yeah, by doing this, it actually works. You can also remove the multi-site add-on if you don't have a multi-site setup, of course, that would work the same. But be aware that when you follow this suggestion, which is also on the Stack Overflow, then it won't work unless you also make these exceptions. And well, the upside is that with the Sitecore, it works perfectly well to combine both static generated and server rendered pages. And it's a very powerful solution, I think. The downside, though, is that it requires some hard-coded configuration. And the thing I do not really like is that you have content in your database that actually has to match physical files on disk. So, for example, those pages cannot be renamed by the content team, which, by the way, is a bad idea for SEO anyway. But if you would change the item in Sitecore, you would implicitly also change the rendering method. And there's one more thing to think about, and that is localizing URLs. We have a project where we not only use a language slur, but also use localization in the URL. And that means that you actually have to translate your exception, in this case card, to all other languages as well, and create a multitude of hard-coded exceptions. So be aware of that. If you have an elegant solution for this, or if you come across it, then please share it. It would be great. And then one more thing on rendering configuration, and is that you should be aware that your rendering host that is being used is publicly available. The URL is actually containing a hash, a GUID, so it's not easy to guess. But once you share this URL, anyone can view its content, and that not only goes for test and acceptance environments in XM Cloud, but also for the production environment. And that means that any unpublished content that is not served from the edge is actually also available when you visited this rendering host URL. I've registered the feature request for this, and I think it might be around this week, or maybe it's already out. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it. There would be a change planned in the configuration that it makes it possible to actually add authentication to the rendering host URL. But if you do not have that yet and you're using XM Cloud, just be aware of this. It's a good thing to know. So on to the next step. You have your content resolving, you have your rendering configuration, and then you want to set up your deployments for XM Cloud. And as with many things, all good things come in threes. But before I'm going to talk about deployments, I want to share a little life hack in the world of using XM Cloud. It's a very simple one, but I think it's worth sharing. When you're working with XM Cloud, you're always working with containers locally. And if you do not properly shut them down at the end of the day, you will sometimes get some network issues. And they're quite easy to solve because you just have to shut down your containers again or anyhow, and then do some and then prune your networks on Docker. But to solve the solution for lazy developers, which we are, we've created, instead of Sitecore static, it comes with a down script and an up script. And we created the re-up script, which actually does both, first down, then up, and does a network prune in between. And this way you can always easily start up your containers at the beginning of the day. And the cool thing, by the way, is that working with containers in XM Cloud means that you also see changes coming in on a regular basis, which is very cool. It actually aligns with the XM Cloud environment that you have for your customer, or if you are a customer that you have as an organization. So onto the deployment process. You can deploy using the UI, the GUI from XM Cloud, the portal, but you can also deploy using CLI. Works perfectly fine, but we want to have everything scripted using infrastructure as code. We use things like Bicep or ARM and a YAML pipeline, plus some environment configuration, so we can we don't have any manual steps anymore, and we actually want to embed deploying to XM Cloud within our default pipelines. And we are doing that coming from a GitHub code repository, and we're using the Azure DevOps pipelines. In our case, we're not using Vercel for for our implementation at this very moment. Might change, but currently we're using Azure Container Apps, and they work great as well. And that means that our deployment process actually looks like this. And as I've said, we have divided the front end from Sitecore, but also the business logic into microservices. And that's also how we've set up the deployment. We've split it in 3 different pipelines. Front end is we can deploy both the infrastructure because it's infrastructure as code using Bicep. And we can deploy our application using a YAML pipeline. And then we have 3 environments: the development, acceptance, and the production environment. In Azure, we use the container apps, and then we orchestrate that ourselves. Within Sitecore, in the XM Cloud, you actually have at least for any license 2 non-prods and a production environment, and we connect those to our front end. And we used a deployment process to deploy using the CLI scripts, but embedded in our deployment scripts. And then we use promote if we want to promote it from development to acceptance. And I'll show you what that means in a bit. And then for microservices, it's actually exactly the same as the front end in setup. What's even more beautiful is that Sitecore is also working on separating the front end deployment from the platform deployment within XM Cloud. I didn't go into that in this talk because I kind of assumed that you would know, but when you deploy to XM Cloud, you also need to deploy your front end to XM Cloud for the editing host. So Sitecore has to run your front-end code for Sitecore pages to be able to edit them inline, and for the preview. So that means that when your front-end changes, I would have to start 2 pipelines anyhow. But Sitecore is splitting this in its architecture, and it will be possible to deploy the front-end separately. And then we also have the synchronization of our Sitecore items and the platform deployment. So once we get there, it will be great, because when something changes in the front end in your Next.js application, but not in Sitecore, you don't have to deploy to Sitecore anymore. When you changed an integration, but you didn't change Sitecore, you only have to deploy your own microservices. And that also means that your resilience is going to improve, as I've promised you. And that means that when you deploy one part, it's going to be quicker, but it's also going to pose less risk in your whole environment, and it's going to increase the uptime and availability of your application as well. So yeah, the architecture even boils down into a very clear and clean deployment strategy, I think. And as I said, we use 2 mechanisms to deploy to XM Cloud. We use deploy and promote, and I'll explain what that means. I've seen people using the CLI deployment command to deploy to each of the environments. And as I've said, you have 2 non-prods and a production environment within XM Cloud. But you actually don't want to do that. You want to deploy once to your, for example, test or development environment, and then promote that build to your UI, your acceptance environment, and your production environment. In the UI, that's very straightforward. If you create a script for that, it's a little bit more of a hassle. But it's worth it because, well, it saves you time. Promoting is quicker because it doesn't build your solution again. You on the right, you see that I've done a deployment first, and it took 6 minutes and 22 seconds. And then I promoted that to a different environment, and it skipped the build step. My deployment this time took a little bit longer, but my post actions were quicker, so that averages out, and now it was only 4 minutes and 52 seconds. But the other thing is that you guarantee that you have the same built-in version, which is going to also improve your resilience, so your rigidity of your process. So what you have to do is you create a deployment in CLI, but don't start it. And then retrieve the deployment ID and execute a deployment start referencing that ID. And when you've done that, you have an ID to refer to using the environment promote command. So it's not named deployment anymore, but it actually has the same effect. And then using CLI, you do an environment promote, and you're using the source ID parameter to populate with the ID of the deployment. I have created, we in the team have created a script for this to integrate this in a scripted pipeline in Azure DevOps, and I will probably share that shortly with you, so you can reuse that as well if you like. So one more topic before I'm closing up, and that is, of course, we did have the inevitable teething troubles when working with some new technology, as I said. And I want to share them with you. Absolutely not to show what's wrong or to bash on XM Cloud, but more to, well, actually make a few points. The first one is that, yes, there were some issues, but they were quite minor. The second one is Sitecore is improving them, and is improving this and fixing them very quickly. And I also have some proof for that, which I'll show in a minute. And another one is that I want you, well, it may save you time searching for the root cause when you bump into the same issues as we did. And the last important thing is that you have to have a different mindset and look into this as well. I'll get to what that means in a minute. So the first one we encountered is an out of memory exception on the type declaration generation, which is the starter kit is using the GraphQL introspection mechanism. And what it does, it includes all of the data templates configured in Sitecore, which is quite a lot because it's using ESXi. And that means that you get a very big introspection result file. And that on itself, when running GraphQL update, generates, when using the graphlet command, it's causing an out of memory exception. So there's actually what on the bottom right, I've mentioned the issue number, and it's a known issue. So when it's solved, or if it's solved, you can view the status using that, or request the status using that number. There's actually a few workarounds. You can increase memory allocated to Node.js, but that's actually just postponing the issue because this is growing. 300K lines is for the starter setup. So if you are going to add templates to that, it's going to increase. The other solution is to not use GraphQL introspection, which means that you're either have to find a solution yourself to use typed GraphQL queries, or either you're using just untyped GraphQL queries. And that obviously is a possibility, but then you are running the risk of finding your issues at runtime, which is not as easy to discover as at build time. So I wouldn't advise it as well. So the best way to solve this is to actually create a custom patch file to clear the defaults. And so you don't want Sitecore to use the templates you do not use within the GraphQL queries. I'll show you. We've created a patch file, and this is also on the internet on Stack Exchange, but the one shared over there, I think, doesn't work very well, or has an issue. So I've changed it into my own version, we've created a patch on the left side. You see what's included by default in Axiom Cloud configuration, which is all of the templates. And what we've done is we patched that with only using our own templates. And that brings down the number of templates immensely and solves the issue. And the fun thing is that this, in the project that we're currently running, was the first thing we actually deployed to the Sitecore CM role in Axiom Cloud. Up until this, all the rendering stuff and all the content resolving was done without any customizations or deploying anything to Sitecore. We left the platform deployment completely standard and default. And I think that's what you want. So this is the one exception. And maybe when there's a better solution to this, we can remove this again. The next one is that you have to understand when using pages in your Next.js app that you have to deal with multiple URLs. And so you can't use relative URLs. You have to preset the prefix the all the asset URLs with the rendering host base URL. So Pages is running in an environment, pages.sitecore.io, which is running separately from your Axiom Cloud tenant. Then you have your customer project environment of Sitecore Cloud. That's another URL as well. And that's the iframe where your Next.js app is running in edit mode. And then actually the rendering host has a third URL. So if you understand this, you can work around it with just using the correct URLs. But be aware of this. And then the third one, this is my proof that things are being fixed very quickly. I've built this this talk, I think, a little over a month ago. And only a few days after, this was already fixed. So this is no longer the case. We found that GraphQL served also languages of items that didn't have a version in that specific language, which is obviously an issue. I won't go into detail right now because it's not relevant anymore. But the fun thing is that I've created this slide deck. I presented it the next day. One of the people from Sitecore was in the audience, and he said, "Well, I think we fixed that just very recently." And the next day, indeed, it was automatically fixed within our project. We didn't even have to do a deployment to Axiom Cloud. It just worked again, or it just worked because it didn't work before. And that's my fourth point, actually, I wanted to make. When working with Axiom Cloud, you have to factor in the SaaS flexibility. And what I mean by that is SaaS software means continuous updates. And it means that bug fixes and improvements by Sitecore are available without a deployment, which is great, because if someone in the ecosystem discovers a bug, Sitecore will fix it very quickly, and it doesn't have to wait until a new version is published of the, as was the case with the platform DXP, but they can just push an update. And then all of the solutions are fixed right away. But when you think about it, there would also be the possibility that sometimes things go wrong, that a bug fix or an update creates an issue. And that means that your production environment is no longer stable between your own deployments. So in the past, you had one Sitecore version that was stable, and you put your own implementation on top of that, and you published that to the production environment. And as long as no one was touching the production environment, at least the code wouldn't change. So that couldn't go wrong on itself. And I think that is no longer the case. So you have to factor this in. You have to account for this. And that means that you have to, for example, implement front-end testing. and do end-to-end monitoring on production for your vital processes. Use GitHub Actions, use Node.js, use dependency updates, for example, also in Git. Use sorry, I said use Node.js. I meant use Cypress for your front-end test, but also I have Node.js on this slide because it's also important that you keep your dependencies up to date. We had one issue where we reported a bug, but it actually was not a bug. It was just that we didn't bump our Node version, and it was no longer aligning with what's on production and what's being used. So the bug was actually fixed already, but not for our Node version. Make sure to keep your dependencies up to date, to do dependency tracking in GitHub, to also keep track of changes in the starter kit that's on GitHub of Sitecore, and do some front-end testing and monitoring, for example, using Cypress, to make sure that everything is still working as intended. So, time to wrap up and for a conclusion. For us, Atom Cloud meant a cleaner architecture, both for Sitecore as well as our own implementation, which leads to actually a better implementation. And avoiding customizations doesn't limit your options. It actually enhances maintainability. And as you've seen, all of the things I was used to do in deploying to Sitecore with the item API, in using custom content resolvers to alter my data model, everything is still possible, but in a better maintainable way. The deployment process, but also the development environment and process improves a lot. I think in ownership, in control, but also in reduced complexity, because all of your own code lives in microservices or in the front end and no longer on top of your Sitecore implementation. And if you adopt that composable mindset, then you're going to get some pretty, well, pleasant to work at, but also very resilient and scalable architectures. And after all, Sitecore XM Cloud isn't all that different, especially when you're familiar with JSS and SXA. And although Experience Edge and Pages at the beginning still had some issues, it's improving every day, and I think it's very stable. We are already live on one of our XM Cloud projects, and it's working great. So we actually just love the experience, but also the new development experience. Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm not sure if we have time left for that, but if you want, go ahead. I don't hear anyone. Yeah.
I think we're top of the hour. So in case if they have any questions, I think they can reach out to you.
Absolutely. You're always welcome to reach out. I have my email. I'm on Slack with my full name. So that's also, I think, rob.habraken. And I'm on Twitter as well, or X, I should say. Not very active on that anymore. So, but do reach out, preferably via Slack. And I would love to engage in a conversation with you about XM Cloud.
Thanks, Rob. It was a great session, and it was very informative because you were sharing the experience rather than just talking about certain topics. So it was really, really helpful, and it gives a lot of insights into what the developers and architects need to expect when they are embarking on this XM Cloud journey. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
I also
That's
thank all the
great to hear.
I also thank all the participants who attended this session. And thank you, everyone. Have a nice day and rest of the evening.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.